Made in Abyss is a breathtakingly gorgeous anime with an immediately effective premise. Adventurers descend into the chasm looking for treasure and other mysteries hidden under the surface. The series promises a beautiful, whimsical, nearly Studio Ghibli-style anime about a girl and her new robot friend descending into the earth below on a grand adventure, where surely nothing bad could ever happen. Madoka Magica is a throwback to the golden age of magical girl anime, where becoming a magical girl is something to aspire to be revered. And if it was a Faustian bargain with a sinister Mephistopheles, well, why would he look like this then? The Promised Neverland is one of the most incredible first episodes I've ever seen of anything, which sets up and pays off this fantastic game of cat and mouse for the rest of this series, which makes it such a tragedy that the show was cancelled and never renewed for a second season. Don't look it up. All of these series have something in common, and it's the fact that they're manipulating you. These anime weaponize your expectations, your familiarity of how other stories perpetuate and execute genre tropes and cliches to lure you into a false sense of security in what you think you might be watching before flipping the script and revealing something darker entirely. And by the time you've realized it, it's already too late. And my favorite example of this is the recent 2024 anime Delicious in Dungeon. From the outset, nothing about Dungeon Meshi seems like it would belie world building, depth, politics, darkness, or even horror. From its simplistic art style, charming music, and playful banter, it just seems cozy, familiar, silly even. Characters interact in a realistic, light-hearted way, as if they're just hanging out with a group of friends, and if you've played tabletop games before, it's almost exactly what you're used to around the table. Confrontations with monsters feel dangerous, sure, but never truly perilous, especially as we're reminded time and time again that death isn't necessarily something to fear in this particular dungeon. And why? Well, we don't have to ask questions, right? Surely it's just how this world is. We don't question it, because this is just a cozy cooking anime. It's not that deep. We're introduced to the wacky monster-eating premise and given a clear, distinct end goal of the series: slay the red dragon, rescue Fallon. As an audience, we have everything we need to fill in the blanks on how this story goes. The party is going to explore the dungeon, rescue their healer, and continue on their many adventures as credits roll on the final episode. Right? Well, that's our assumption anyway. Just like Made in Abyss presents itself as a light-hearted romp to explore and find treasure, and Hunter x Hunter is about this cute little guy reenacting Dragon Ball, and Evangelion begins on your certainty that you've seen enough anime about heroic teenaged mecha pilots to know how this story goes. Delicious in Dungeon 2 is a fun, low-stakes, slice-of-life fantasy cooking anime. And that, my friends, is the lie. Delicious in Dungeon is a series that's almost obsessed with appearing unassuming before turning everything on its head. From its milquetoast human fighter protagonist to the standard array of party members to the tried and true selection of fantasy monsters and races, we're almost meant to roll our eyes at how, well, typical everything seems. It seems like every fantasy cliche is present and accounted for, but that's for a reason. The first few episodes are playful Monster of the Week style fare, with each episode broken down into 2 encounters. For a pacing we quickly come to expect: new monster, combat, cooking, continue. But where Dungeon Meshi really begins to divert from this path is how some of the encounters come together to form a sort of underlying narrative. That is, if you're paying attention. There's talks of souls of an ancient country buried in the ruins of the dungeon, of strange world events happening above ground, of a slumbering god that's haunting the dreams of those in the dungeon. And before you know it, just like those shows I mentioned earlier, you've been bait and switched into something you never could have imagined. And in a way, it's almost thematic. Just as the characters themselves have no idea what they've gotten themselves into, neither did you. The dungeon itself lures parties in with the premise of adventure before becoming too dangerous to back out. But Dungeon Meshi also did the same to you, didn't it? Shows becoming darker and more serious as the stakes escalate is pretty standard in fiction. As narratives build and conflict rises, it only makes sense that dangers become that much more perilous for our characters to overcome. In typical shonen anime, this increasing severity usually presents itself in villain-centric arcs, with every new, more powerful opponent raising the stakes of the series, once again thrusting our spiky-haired energy boy into the position of an underdog. It's a tried-and-true formula, but in Dungeon Meshi, we're not really bound by the same shonen rules. There's a relative power scaling adopted from video gamey style floors of the dungeon, and things quickly go from level 1 slimes and skeletons to monsters that are increasingly abstract. Fights are no longer just swords and spells, but puzzles to be solved. And what once felt like a monster of the week cooking gimmick now feels like precarious fights that are just one slip up away from being deadly. Because Dungeon Meshi isn't a story about cooking. Not really. Dungeon Meshi is a story about eating. And that's the stark difference, that unflinching natural reality that sets up some real horror. This entire series is the survival of who can eat who: monsters, human, and the dungeon itself. There's no morality, no good or evil, no malice in the act of eating, but everything in this dungeon exists as food to something else. The uncaring, cyclical nature of eating is one thing, but Dungeon Meshi also isn't afraid to go to some darker places thematically as well. Death, loss, occult magic, lesbians. It's through the lens of a typical fantasy world that all of these things can be explored in a way that both weaves in and out of our expectations and also just makes sense for this world, for this story and these characters. It's not afraid to leverage its goofy tone and premise to deliver some moments that are genuinely terrifying. Fallon's resurrection as a chimera, Senchi's harrowing backstory, the escalating threat of a seemingly living dungeon, the surrealist fever dream of Marcel's nightmare of age and death, the dark history of the Golden Country and Thistle's descent into madness, eating a raw worm and your tummy feeling bad. But it's not just plot points either. Some of the monster lore is genuinely haunting if you sit down and think about it, like the folklore of changelings. Because the stories being recounted by Laios, who can't help but gush about how cool monsters are, it never really sinks in how low-key disturbing it is that real children came back to their villages looking like trolls and were tortured or straight up burned alive by their own families that didn't even recognize them. Likewise, when we hear tales of the complete annihilation of Kabru's hometown, the idea of a dungeon overflowing with monsters seems like a Lovecraftian horror story. That is, before we realize that we're moments away from that same thing happening to this dungeon. The problem with a lot of subversive narratives is they quickly become infamous for that exact reason. Shows like Madoka and Evangelion and Hunter x Hunter are so highly regarded because of how well they deconstruct or subvert the longtime conventions of their respective genres. And series like Made in Abyss and Promised Neverland are notorious for their tonal swerves, becoming infinitely darker than you ever could have expected going in. Which makes it quite interesting that you never really hear Delicious in Dungeon talked about as one of those shows. You don't hear Delicious in Dungeon recommended as a tonal bait and switch or as a deconstruction of fantasy, even though at times it totally is. And I think that's for a few reasons. Delicious in Dungeon, despite everything, never loses its humor, its playful writing, and its hope. Even when things are at their darkest, the characters never lose sight of why they're in the dungeon to begin with, to save their friend. And they always default back to being friends and companions who are there for each other no matter what. In a real the treasure was the friends we made along the way sense, the characters of Dungeon Meshi, their bond and their chemistry together, their willingness to crack jokes and recalibrate after every setback, that's what keeps the show from ever becoming too dark. After every encounter that threatens to turn the series into something too bleak, there's a moment of rest, some laughs, and another delicious meal. And you know that things are going to be okay.